Welcome to the Conscious Corner. I've been obsessed with conscious my whole life. I'm not sure why. I don't know anything, but we'll figure it out together. I don't know, but I really need to know this. Is neuroplasticity real? And the premise of the discussion that I have with myself is if I think about something hard enough and enough times, the quantity and quality, will I rewire regions of my brain? And that is downward causation when it comes to emergence. Am I able to manipulate my brain? And manipulate's an interesting word because there's no other way to put it. I have to trick my brain into doing the things that it doesn't want to do. Brains adhere to unknownism. Actually, the universe adheres to unknownism. Once it knows something, it binds certain neurons and it wants to stay that way. That's the laws of nature. Laws of physics will say energy conservation and principle of least action. Change is action. To change something, you're changing its energy states, and that's something that nothing in the universe wants to do. And so it's interesting that our brains are wired that way. But we have the emergent property of the mind, the mental space, and consciousness, where we can think about wanting a different outcome for how we feel. This goes back to we are primarily feeling machines. We think about wanting to be happy because we know the outcome of happiness we've experienced previously in the past. It's a good thing. What's interesting about the brain is evolutionary. It will search for pleasure or pain. It looks for happiness and sadness. But happiness and sadness are those emergent properties of the neurotransmitters. It knows what's good and bad for survival instincts. And ironically, it needs to know more about life to survive. But yet change is difficult because you have to put energy into the system to change. And this is the circular dependency that goes on throughout our lives. And what we do is we tend to emerge higher level thinking, thoughts and feelings that don't necessarily exist at the micro level. The granularity of our feelings and our emotions, happiness, pleasure, joy, feeling empty. What does that mean to feel empty? I wrestle with this a lot. Depending on the word that we have and the culture that we're born in, we understand these granularities and the differences. If you go to another region of the world that necessarily in their language doesn't have the meaning of joy or emptiness, then they don't experience that. It's all sadness or it's all whatever they have in their culture. That tells us that a lot of what we are and who we are psychologically is based on where we're born and the timeline in space-time and what we experience when we're younger in the environment that we're in. This is nurture. And so our psychology and how deep we think it is or feel it is, and this goes back to the original premise of the question, is what's really happening at the neuronal level and how much are we affecting it by our psychology? It's a big question because it's also touching on dualism. And Rene Descartes, everybody's heard this quote, "I think, therefore I am," was the first person to really bump up against, is the mind and the body two different things? The mind energy, is it different to the body energy? If you start to break it down, you'll think, is it or is it the same? And what's the boundary? And how do we affect the body or the physical working of the body with our minds? And then that leads to physicalism, that everything is physical, and idealism is that if you look at the far scale of idealism, everything's in our minds. Either way, we know there is certain energy that our minds have that when we think about something, it affects the physical working of our body. Moving our muscles is exactly that. We want to move in certain directions and do certain things. It's a little bit autonomous. As you get into adulthood, you've learned how to move your muscles. But there's still electrochemical signals being sent through our nervous system that we thought about. And so we are converting mind energy into mechanical energy, into movement energy. And those energy transformations is exactly what the universe does. This is not unlike what happens in any system. You put energy into a system, you're either giving it momentum, as in you've applied a force and it moves, or you're giving it mass. These two it's all the same thing though. I'm going to make that premise right now that the physical universe obeys symmetries. It has to do the conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and that's all it is. It is all the same energy that goes through energy transformations. I'm calling it energy transformations because I'm taking time out of this equation. I'm not talking about time. Time is a subjective experience that our brain gives us. Time is an experience because of how heavy we are, and by heavy I mean humans are mass. Humans are encapsulated energy. Encapsulated energy gives mass, and that gives rise to the fact that we interact with space-time in a very particular way, which gives us the experience of time, the subjective experience of time. But in reality, what's happening out there in the world is energy transformations. It's going from one energy state to the other. The laws of nature and physics is playing out with energy transformations. And so when we think about that energy transformation of the mind to the body, we also now talking about one level deeper where I want to think a certain thing of how I feel. When the feelings, which is another subjective experience, get thrown into the mix, I now want to wake up tomorrow and tell myself, hey, I am happy. It doesn't quite work that way. There's something about the binding, the strength of the bindings in my brain at least, that over time bound a certain belief or a feeling, like that emptiness, the sadness, the not good enough. What does it mean to feel not good enough? That's a very psychological question. A lot of us experience this, but what is it based on, and what are we changing when we wake up? If I wake up tomorrow and say, no, I am good enough. These affirmations, as crazy as they sound, don't necessarily work by themselves, but over time, what I've experienced is that, using time because it's a very subjective discussion now, but let's go back to energy transformation. If I put the right energy transformations into my mind and tell myself I am good enough, or look for evidence, or do the things that help me feel good enough, because the strength of those bindings goes back years. I was telling myself this for 10 years, 20 years plus, maybe even 30 years. Okay, I'm not that old. Maybe, I don't know. Actually, I am that old. But anyway, I told myself so many years, those neuronal bindings, the strength of those bindings was so strong, and the neurotransmitters and the synaptic connections were so much in the regions of the brain, which is primarily the ventral tangential area. That's our reward system, because not good enough foundation is like we're not rewarding ourselves for being who we are. That had bound so strongly that it takes time. Something is interesting about time. You need to put enough energy transformations in it for it to unwind and want to unbind into a different state. And that's very fascinating, because I think it tells us a lot about the universe itself and how we interact with it and how we work. And that downward causation of mind energy to brain rewiring itself, neuroplasticity, is a thing that I feel regardless of whether it exists. And I think this is the premise of a lot of discussions that are metaphysical, like the self or anything that we could talk about. I will experience it. I absolutely experience myself. I experience free will, and you could say I'm a compatibilist, that word. In some ways, yes, I am. I do believe that we experience these things, but they don't necessarily exist in the universe. And what I'm primarily focused on is figuring out the boundary of the two. And what I've landed on is the physics of emergence. I'm working on the physics of emergence. There is a physics there that we don't understand yet that translates what's happening in our mental space and what's happening out there in the universe and what's happening in our brains at the neuronal level. And neurons obey quantum mechanics. There's no question about it, because they're made from the same stuff that we experience when we look out in the universe. But then how can we affect that with our mind? How can we put mental energy into affecting a physical reality changing? And over time, I've experienced that with how I felt, that not good enough. Like the way I valued myself, the philosophy of valuism is, self-valuism is very critical here. How you value yourself, how I valued myself, played out in every aspect of my life. I mean, when I think about it now, it feels like, duh, of course. If I don't value myself and I'm trying to provide value to others in my career, in my job, in my relationships, in my happiness, and how I experience life, of course I'm not going to show up. And so it makes perfect sense now, but at the time it didn't. So I'm going to work on the physics of emergence to explain how the mental energy changes the physical energy we have, not just mechanically, but also with the neurons in our brain, and how that then gives us a different level of subjective experience.